talked about legislation and how it is enforced. I now turn to other services provided by governments. The first of these is national defense. History shows that international conflicts are common and destructive of both persons and property. Defending myself against attack from foreign powers is not something that I can effectively do myself, and I am happy to pay taxes to the government so it can defend me. History shows that countries often underestimate the nature and extent of external threats. A government that learns from this will therefore take external threats very seriously and allocate adequate resources to protecting against them. Again, I am happy to pay the taxes that this requires. Maybe the most apparent external threat is invasion. Even a minimal government therefore needs to provide some form of military function, adequate for national defense. The form and scale of this military function will vary between different times and places. For example, a landlocked country will not require a navy, whereas this will be a key element of defense for an island nation. In the modern world, fighting wars is an increasingly complex and technical business. Training troops may therefore take longer than in the past. It is not just a question of handing a young man a musket and pointing him in the direction of the enemy. Relying on mass conscription to raise a large army quickly if needed is therefore no longer a sound strategy. Moreover, technology is such that manpower, while still necessary, is less crucial than historically. These considerations imply a need to maintain professional armed forces on a scale that is adequate for national defense. As wars can arise quickly and are not always against the anticipated opponent, these armed forces need to have a range of capabilities and capacity to fight whoever, wherever, and however necessary. A conventional army provides no defense against nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction. Having your own nuclear weapons and being prepared to use them is an effective deterrent against nuclear attack. Thus, the number of countries with nuclear capabilities continues to grow. It is inevitable that if nuclear weapons are out there, then eventually someone will use them. The effects of a nuclear war would be devastating and not limited to the protagonists. Therefore, to protect its people from the effects of other countries' nuclear wars, a rational government will push for global nuclear disarmament. This requires those countries with nuclear weapons to decommission them in a coordinated manner, and for all governments to be clear that economic and, crucially, military force will be used to prevent any country that seeks to develop nuclear capabilities from doing so. In practice, this involves a level of mutual trust and cooperation that seems beyond the abilities of current governments. Another risk is economic warfare. Countries that rely on imports to maintain the lives of their people are very vulnerable if those imports are cut off. Again, I would therefore expect any government to aim for a position where its country does not rely on others for food, energy, or to equip its armed forces. In practice, this may have to be a very long-term objective. For instance, the UK has a population that is significantly larger than can be supported by the UK's farmland. To eliminate the UK's reliance on food produced elsewhere will therefore require significant reductions in the UK's population. In the absence of mass genocide, which is not consistent with a government's key objective of protecting people's persons, this will take several generations to achieve. In passing, I note that a long-term target of significantly reducing the human population, both in the UK and worldwide, would be desirable. Fewer people would mean less strain on the planet's natural resources, less pollution, less climate change, and less destruction of habitats. This would lead to better quality of life. It would also reduce the numbers of animal and plant species driven to extinction by human activity. This is desirable because such species may be useful to us, for example in developing drugs, controlling pests, or for their nutritional value, and also because people enjoy nature in all its variety, and extinctions reduce that variety. It is sometimes argued that declining populations are aging populations, and a lack of younger workers will lead to economic catastrophe. This may have been the case when the economy relied on manpower. In these times of mechanization and automation, I do not think it is a problem. As well as aiming for self-sufficiency in key areas, governments will want to ensure that structures and processes are resilient. If all the energy in the country is provided by a single power station, this is more vulnerable than a diversified network of smaller power stations. If food production is concentrated in a particular area, or food distribution networks rely on a small number of distribution centers, then it will be easier to disrupt the supply of food than if food is produced and distributed locally. However, although self-sufficiency in some areas is desirable, it is also the case that if two countries are economically entwined, this does help to prevent wars between them, as fighting each other can cripple the economies of both. Thus, from the perspective of national defense, it makes sense for governments to encourage free trade, but without compromising self-sufficiency in core areas. And of course, eliminating the UK's reliance on other countries for food would not mean that food could not be imported into or exported from the UK. It only means that, even in the absence of any such imports or exports, the UK would produce enough food to feed its own population. In the modern world, external threats are not only from other countries. Terrorist activity is a very real threat, and counter-terrorist activity will therefore be a key activity of government. Another service provided by many governments is the provision of benefits to those who are unable to support themselves. So, why might a government pay such benefits? Well, in the absence of such benefits, those who are unable to find work will starve. This is not just theoretical. It happened historically, and continues to happen, in nations that do not provide such benefits. If I was starving, and was watching my family starve, and there was no legal way I could get money, or otherwise obtain food, then what would I do? I would turn to crime, whether that was directly stealing food, or stealing things I could sell for food, or holding people up and taking their money, or whatever. So, providing benefits to people who would otherwise starve supports the key government objective of protecting persons and property rights. In the absence of such benefits, other ways would have to be found to stop starving people from committing crimes. Inflicting very heavy punishments on convicted criminals might deter people from committing crimes. This has been tried. There was a time in Britain, before the days of the welfare state, when the penalty for stealing was death. However, there are two problems. Firstly, I may well be prepared to commit the crime and risk the death penalty, if the alternative is a slow death by starvation. So, the death penalty may not be an effective deterrent. Secondly, a jury may not consider that it is appropriate to kill someone for stealing a loaf of bread, to feed their starving children, and may declare the guilty to be not guilty, purely to avoid this outcome. This makes a nonsense of the law. Providing benefits to starving people therefore appears attractive. It has other advantages. In a democracy, all voters are in it together. Sitting by and watching my fellow voters starve feels uncomfortable. And, as previously discussed, providing a financial safety net protects workers from exploitation by unscrupulous employers, and would allow considerable simplification and reduction of employment law. Note that I am talking about a financial safety net here, sufficient to provide people with the bare essentials of life. I am emphatically not arguing for any redistribution of wealth beyond that. Government exists to protect people's property, not arbitrarily relieve them of it and present it to someone else. The next question is whether these benefits have to be provided by the government, or if they can come from other sources. For example, you might suggest that benefits can be provided on a charitable basis. You may point out that if I don't want to see my fellow voters starve, I don't need to. I can put my hand in my pocket and donate to charities that will feed them. If people don't make sufficient donations, and people starve, well, voters have effectively decided that, in aggregate, they don't care enough to do anything about it. This is all true. The problem with this approach is that it is very likely that people will still starve, either because the charities will be selective in who they pay benefits to, or because, in times of high unemployment, there will be insufficient charitable donations to pay benefits to everyone. To be effective in preventing crime driven by extreme poverty, the benefits need to cover everyone. If the government is going to mandate this, then it will need to underwrite the benefits. You might suggest that the private sector could provide such benefits through insurance. But the people who would need the insurance most will be those who are charged the highest premiums. Many of them would not be able to afford to pay, or may be unwilling to do so. Thus they would not be covered. To avoid this, the government would have to make such insurance compulsory, and enforce pricing restrictions on insurers, to make sure that premiums were affordable. So, it does appear that if support is to be provided to those who are unable to support themselves, then significant and extensive government involvement is going to be required, and so having the government itself provide that support makes sense. But, you may point out, such benefits do not have to be provided in monetary form. They could be provided in kind. Where people cannot support themselves, the government could directly provide them with shelter, clothing, and food. Maybe it could also find work for them to do. This is not a new idea. Before the welfare state was invented, there was the workhouse. Maybe an updated, less harsh, version of the workhouse could replace the benefit system. Maybe it could. But how, for instance, do you deal with people who own their own home, but currently have no cash to buy food? Would they only be allowed into the workhouse once they have sold their property? What would they eat while the sale was going through? Paying a benefit in cash allows recipients to spend it in a way that best fits their particular circumstances and meets their particular needs. It is also simple to administer. So having a government benefit provided in monetary form looks like the way to go. How might this work in practice? Well, the purpose of the benefit is to make sure that no one is driven to crime because they cannot afford the bare essentials of life. So, the desired outcome is that everyone should have an income at least sufficient to provide the basic necessities. The easiest way to achieve this is for the state to pay an income of this amount to all voters. This might sound like a very expensive way of achieving the goal. But actually, if the benefit system is sensibly integrated with the tax system, it is not. When people have additional sources of income, they will be paying tax. If the tax system is designed appropriately, the net financial position of the government, after allowing for benefit payments and tax receipts, would be unaffected. And, because an identical benefit will be paid to everyone, the administration of it will be very much simplified. Current systems, with different types of needs-based and means-tested benefits, requiring applications to be processed, fraudulent claims weeded out, and multiple payments made, can be swept away. This saves administration costs. Paying universal benefits also eliminates benefit traps, where if you are unemployed you may consider that it is not worth taking a job that is available to you, because if you do so you will lose your benefits. Under a universal benefit system you would continue to receive benefits, regardless of whether you take the work or not. As everyone gets the benefit, this approach avoids the situation where people do not claim benefits because they do not know that they are entitled to them. It also removes the stigma that is attached to claiming benefits. Finally, the logic of a democracy requires that everyone should have the same legal rights. Paying an identical benefit to everyone clearly meets this requirement. Governments do not only provide financial benefits, but many also provide health services. For example, the UK National Health Service, NHS, is a public sector organisation that provides largely free healthcare to UK residents. It is quite possible for a country to operate without a national health service. The NHS was only introduced after the Second World War. There are other countries today that do not operate a national health service. So, what was the rationale for introducing the NHS? Well, prior to the introduction of the NHS, if you became ill, then only private medical treatment was available. If you were unable to pay for this, then there were various charitable institutions that you could turn to. However, such charitable medical treatment was not always available. The outcome was that, if you were sick, and could be cured, but you could not afford private treatment, there was a real risk that you would die. Now, I would rather be cured of a disease than die of it. I am happy to pay tax now, so that if I fall ill in future, at a point when I have no money, I can access free medical treatment. That is what the NHS provides, and it protects me by doing so. You may point out that I can achieve the same results by taking out medical insurance. It is not necessary for the government to get involved. The government could step aside and leave me to make my own private arrangements. Such arrangements can be better tailored to my own circumstances and needs, and would therefore be preferable to a standard, one-size-fits-all, government service. But insurers will not underwrite unlimited risk. Policies of insurance will always be limited, often in multiple ways. They may only cover me for a limited period. They may only cover me for treatment up to a certain value. They may not cover pre-existing conditions. I can pay higher premiums to get more extensive cover, but there will always be limits to the amount I can afford to pay, and ultimately to the level of cover an insurer is willing to provide. Further, if I pay the premium, and the insurance company subsequently goes out of business, I may not be able to benefit from the cover that I have paid for. A system backed by the taxpayer does not have these limitations. So, the NHS does in principle seem to be a good idea. And the NHS is very popular in the UK, so it appears that most UK voters agree with me. However, the NHS does represent a massive burden on the taxpayer. And I do not want to pay more tax than I need to. So, are there ways in which the cost of the NHS could be reduced? You might suggest that access to the NHS could be means tested, so it only provides free treatment for those who can't afford to pay. In some areas this is already the case, for example, prescriptions and dental treatment are not free for all. But the principle of making those who can pay, could be extended much further, in theory to the extent that the NHS becomes self-financing. A key problem with this is that, if I am one of those paying for NHS treatment, I am not only paying for the costs of my treatment, but I am also subsidizing treatment costs for those who do not pay. If I paid for private medical treatment, I would not be subsidizing others, and so private medical treatment will be cheaper than NHS treatment. The only people who will be using the NHS will be those who can't afford to pay, and the costs of their treatment will fall back on the taxpayer. So, in practice, the NHS would not be self-financing. This could be addressed by making it illegal to provide private medical treatment, so, if I fall ill, I am forced to use the NHS, and pay the higher price. There are practical difficulties in drafting and enforcing such a law. For example, what counts as medical treatment? A visit to a pharmacy to buy cough medicine? Acupuncture? Homeopathy. Having a discussion in the pub with a friend who happens to be a doctor, and buying her a pint. There is also a fundamental issue, that this would involve the state telling doctors who they could treat, and patients who they could seek treatment from, and ultimately using violence to enforce this. The purpose of government is to protect people's persons from violence, not unnecessarily use violence against them. Such a law is clearly not necessary. So, the taxpayer is going to have to pay for the NHS. And, if this is the case, there is a strong argument that treatment should be available to everybody on the same terms. After all, the logic of democracy implies that everyone should have the same legal rights, and if the law entitles everyone to medical treatment, everyone should pay the same price for treatment. What should this price be? It could be nothing. As originally envisaged, the NHS could provide free treatment to all. If there is a price, it must be affordable by everyone. The purpose of the NHS will be fatally undermined if anyone is priced out of receiving treatment. This means that any such charges are unlikely to provide a significant contribution towards the costs of the NHS. However, offsetting costs is not the only reason for levying a charge. Levying a small charge to see a doctor would discourage time wasters, so reducing costs. Any tests and treatment following from that initial consultation would be free. So that everyone could afford to pay it, the charge would have to be set at a level where it could be afforded by those with no income, other than that provided by state benefits, so no more than a few pounds. Another way in which costs can be limited is by restricting the treatments that are provided by the NHS. If the primary purpose of the NHS is to prevent unnecessary death and physical suffering, then NHS treatment could be limited to those with life-threatening conditions, and those suffering from conditions that cause significant physical pain. Medical science is always developing. The role of the NHS is to treat people, not develop new cures. There is therefore a strong argument that only tried and tested, effective treatments should be available on the NHS. Spending taxpayers' money on developing new treatments, trying speculative approaches to see if they work, or testing new drugs, is not justified. These can all be left to the private sector. This may sound harsh. If established cures have failed, a patient may be desperate to roll the dice, in the hope that an experimental cure will work. But a line has to be drawn at some point. Finally, consideration can be given as to how NHS services are delivered. It might be that, rather than a monolithic nationalised NHS, run by the state, a decentralised NHS, where different providers bid to provide different medical services, could reduce total costs. At the end of the day, I am not too concerned about how medical services are delivered to me, as long as they are delivered, and my tax bill is minimised. Most modern governments require that children are educated, and provide free state education to children to facilitate this. Providing this education is a significant cost to the taxpayer. Is it necessary? The key point here is that the children of today are the voters of tomorrow. And, as democracy passes ultimate control of government to voters, if voters are not capable of making informed and rational decisions, then democracy is going to result in uninformed and irrational government. This is undesirable. In a democracy, it is therefore beneficial to educate future voters to a point where they can understand the issues of the day, and the implications of casting their vote one way or the other. So, children need to be taught to read. They need to understand the different ways in which arguments can be constructed, and how to identify ungrounded, irrational or otherwise invalid arguments. Many of the decisions made by government will be financial, so a basic grasp of mathematics and financial matters will be required. Further, I have previously said that, if law and governmental structures are stable, this gives people confidence that these will endure and can be relied on. Teaching children their national history, so that they understand how, and why, current government and legislation have evolved, will help build this confidence. Showing children what happens when law and order breaks down, either because it is not enforced, or because of external factors, such as war, will help them understand why law and order is so desirable. They will see that stable government is something precious, that previous generations have passed on to them, and that they in turn can pass on to future generations. Showing them examples of past mistakes in government will help them to avoid repeating those mistakes when they cast their votes in future. Voters need to understand what society expects of them. This can be achieved by teaching children the law. It will be more straightforward to do this if laws are few, simple, and based on principles, rather than detailed regulation, as I have suggested. Finally, in order that children can demonstrate what they have learned, they will need to be taught how to write. Based on the above, I want voters to be educated to a basic level in reading, writing, logic and rhetoric, mathematics, finance, history, and the law. Indeed, as I have previously indicated, I would not award the right to vote to someone who had not achieved a basic level of proficiency in each of these areas. If this is accepted, then children who are not educated would never be able to vote. If education is not mandatory, there is therefore a risk that large numbers of uneducated people are excluded from the electorate. This is undesirable, as those who have no say in the laws that apply to them are less likely to respect those laws. So, to protect law and order, there is a strong case for government to require that children are educated. If the state is going to mandate that children are educated, it has to ensure that education is available to all. This means state-sponsored education must be provided for those who cannot educate their children privately or at home. The logic of democracy implies that all voters should have equal rights, and so if free state education is provided for some, it should be provided to all who want it. In order for individual people to accept group decisions that they disagree with, democracy requires all voters to feel that they are in it together. Isolating children within a particular group does not encourage them to feel this way. As well as acquiring academic knowledge, it is therefore helpful for future voters to be exposed to as wide a cross-section of society as possible. One way of achieving this is to ban selective schools, whether this be selection on basis of religion, gender, academic ability, parents' ability to pay fees, or whatever, requiring all children to attend the nearest state school. While parents may complain about the resulting lack of choice, it is a means to an end, and matters less if all state schools are of an acceptable standard. For obvious reasons, this approach cannot be applied to private schools. Indeed, many parents send their children to private schools precisely to isolate them from other groups, whether this be the opposite sex, people of other religions, or just people that the parents regard as socially inferior. Thus, if society was to go down this path, it would be logical to ban private schools and home education. However, there are other approaches that could be used to ensure mixing within society, without reducing choices around education in this draconian manner. For example, people could be required to complete a year of national service. This could require young people to spend a year away from home, leading a military type of lifestyle, with board and lodging provided, but only very minimal pay. However, such national service would not be in a military role. There are many things that require unskilled manual labor, that are socially desirable, and that taxpayers may be unwilling to fund at market rates. Examples might be repairing footpaths, or clearing up after fly tippers. Getting gangs of people on national service to perform these tasks would be a cost-effective way of improving the environment for all, while encouraging social cohesion. People might argue that imposing national service on people is oppressive, but, in practice, I envisage replacing 1 year of compulsory education with 1 year of compulsory national service, so I don't think that is any more oppressive than the current system. Such an approach would support the argument that, if children complete their national service, then it does not matter whether they are educated at a state or private school, as long as they learn what they need to learn, and demonstrate that they have done so by passing the required examination, which would be set by the state. In this case, forcing private schools to close down would be an unnecessary use of compulsion by the government. Further, in practical terms, closing private schools would increase the burden on the state schools, which would therefore be less able to provide education of the required standard. Again, private schools can provide facilities, for example allowing children to board, which may be essential for some parents, but are not available at a state school. If there is concern that state schools are inadequate compared to private schools, the solution is surely to improve state schools, rather than close private ones. One area where I do think the legal position of UK private schools can be questioned is their charitable status. This means that private schools are largely exempt from tax. In the past, when the state did not provide education, there may have been reason to encourage the private provision of education in this way. That argument no longer applies, and my view is that private schools should be subject to tax, in the same way as any other business. The extent of state education that I have outlined is more limited than that currently taught. Neither would the basic exam be particularly onerous. The purpose of that exam is to demonstrate an elementary understanding of key concepts, sufficient for basic practical purposes, rather than in-depth technical academic knowledge. The vast majority of people would be expected to pass this exam. This raises a question as to whether compulsory state education would be limited to the mandated subjects I have outlined. If so, one might envisage a system where children are sitting the basic exam at 14 or 15, then completing their national service, and are then unleashed on the world, aged 16 or so. However, many would argue that such an approach would not provide an adequate education. Employers will be looking for workers with skills beyond the minimum that I have outlined. How are children going to obtain those skills? Well, one answer is that employers could teach them, for example through a system of apprenticeship. Another answer might be that if people want additional education, then this could be privately paid for. After all, is this so different from the current situation, where a university degree is, in my view entirely unnecessarily, required for many jobs, and students are expected to take on very significant levels of debt, in order to obtain a degree? On the other hand, if only those who can pay for additional education can get a decent job, does this not guarantee that income inequalities will persist from generation to generation? While inequality may be inevitable, society may still feel that providing children with the tools to enable them to flourish, regardless of their parents' income, is a reasonable thing to do. That then raises a question of how far it is reasonable to go. Should everyone have a right to go to university, funded by the state? That seems to me to be a very expensive way of allowing young people to accumulate knowledge that most of them will never actually use. The wider context also needs to be considered. For example, in a society where there is full employment and a consequent shortage of labor, employers may be more happy to train up staff, and less state intervention may be required. At the end of the day, different voters will have different views on whether balance should be struck between what they consider to be socially desirable and what they are prepared to fund through taxation. The outcome can be determined through the democratic process. I also note that employment rates and the types of employment available differ from location to location, and so, although education policies are currently set nationally in the UK, I see no reason why they could not be set at a more local level, certainly when it comes to what is taught in schools over and above the basic curriculum. It is also important to remember that universities do not only educate, they also carry out academic analysis and research. I am not sure why these academic endeavors should be funded by the taxpayer. If research has practical application, then it will be funded by private enterprise. If it does not, then why is it necessary? If people want to perform research for research's sake, well, good for them, but I don't see why I should be forced to pay them to do so. There are private sector models for supporting such research. There are plenty of people on YouTube, for example, who are producing videos on history, say, based on their own research of primary sources, and fund this through subscriptions paid on a voluntary basis by their viewers. Indeed, it strikes me that in many cases the government is taxing me in order to provide a living for academics who are actively promoting ideologies that seek to overthrow the current social order. The state is supposed to protect me from revolution and anarchy, not promote it. We should defund the universities. I have discussed the role of government in providing a basic financial safety net, in the form of benefits. However, many governments go beyond this, for example providing compensation to victims of crime, or accidents, or natural disasters. Indeed, many governments go as far as providing foreign aid to other countries. Is it reasonable to forcibly extract assets from taxpayers, in order to finance such activities? Now, there are other ways to obtain compensation, that do not involve compulsion. For example, I can purchase insurance that provides cover against crime, natural disasters, and other risks. This allows me to make an individual decision as to whether I want to pay for each type of cover, rather than forcing me through taxation to finance whatever compensation the government may choose to provide. You may point out that, in some cases, I may not be able to afford insurance cover, and so there may be a role for the government. For example, if I live in an area with high crime rates, I may not be able to purchase insurance that covers me against being robbed. But surely, in these circumstances, the government's spending priority should be to reduce crime rates, rather than accepting that crimes are going to be committed, and compensating the victims. I can see some justice in requiring criminals to pay compensation to their victims. I can see none in forcibly taking money from the generality of law-abiding taxpayers in order to do so. If someone has forcibly taken my money, I don't see why this justifies the state forcibly taking your money, so that I can be compensated. Two wrongs do not make a right. And if criminals know that compensation will be paid to their victims, this may reduce any guilt they feel, making them more likely to commit crimes in the first place. This is the opposite of protecting the public. Again, I may not be able to purchase insurance against flooding if I live in a house that has been built on a floodplain. But, before moving into such a house, it is reasonable to expect me to do some basic research into known risks and insurance costs. If I choose to live in the house anyway, knowing the risk of flooding, then why should you be forced to pay extra tax, so the government can compensate me when the inevitable happens? And if I don't do my homework, then I only have myself to blame, and again there seems no justification for you to be forced to pay extra tax, to make good the losses I incur as a result. If a community is worried about the risk of flooding, then building better flood defenses is one way to address this. This can be done by local government, having received a democratic mandate to do so, and funded by local taxation of those communities that will benefit. I can also see that immediately following a flood, there may for example be short-term requirements to provide temporary accommodation, and it may well be that local government is best placed to arrange this. But such intervention would be very limited in time and scope, and funded locally. You might argue that compensation should be provided to alleviate real financial hardship as a result of crime or natural disaster, or indeed from any other cause. But if an adequate financial safety net is provided through state benefits, then this will provide basic support, and no additional compensation will be required. Ultimately, different things happen to different people, as a result of decisions that they make and the luck that they have. This is inevitable. Government cannot deliver equality of outcome, even if this is considered desirable. Providing compensation in some circumstances, but not others, will lead to inconsistencies and inequalities. If I choose to live in a floodplain, and get flooded, why am I more worthy of financial support, than if I choose to invest all my savings in a company that goes bust? Finally, taking a wider view that encompasses all government compensation, foreign aid, and other similar activities, you might say that it is morally right to provide support to alleviate the suffering of victims of circumstances. But that is a personal judgment on your part. If that is how you feel, then you can make personal donations to a suitable charity that will provide that support. If enough others agree with you, then significant levels of compensation will be provided through that route. And no compulsion will have been used. On the other hand, if others don't agree with you, and aren't prepared to make these charitable donations of their own free will, then how can government claim that it has a democratic mandate to extract those donations by force, through taxation? In conclusion, I am prepared to pay taxes to provide a universal basic safety net for my fellow voters. I do not consider that it is reasonable for government to forcibly extract yet more taxes from me, to provide additional support to my fellow voters in particular circumstances, or any support at all to foreign nationals. That is not because I do not appreciate the moral arguments for doing so, it is because I believe that providing such support is not necessary to protect me and my fellow voters, and the choice as to whether or not to provide it should therefore be left to individuals, not imposed on them by the government.